The wind in Dry Willow had a voice. It was not the whisper of pines or the rush of a river, for there were no pines to speak of, and the creek was a cracked tongue of mud. This wind spoke of grit, of things worn down to their essential parts: rock, bone, and patience. It swept from the Bighorn Mountains with a high, lonesome sound, carrying the scent of dust and the bitter perfume of sage. For 3 years, it had brought no rain, only a relentless scouring that left the prairie grass the color of old straw and the hearts of ranchers dry as tinder. Silas Boone felt that wind on the back of his neck as he stood waiting for the afternoon stage. At 42, he was a man carved by this land, his face a map of sun and worry, his hands thick and calloused from work that never seemed to end. He stood with the stillness of a man who conserves his energy, his faded denim trousers and worn chambray shirt seeming less like clothes and more like a second skin. He was here to collect a housekeeper, a decision that felt like a stone in his gut. It had been 2 years since he buried Eleanor. 2 years of dust settling on her things, of silence pressing in from the walls of the small ranch house they had built together. The advertisement had been an act of desperation, penned late one night when the loneliness was a physical weight, and the sight of another greasy plate in the wash basin felt like a final defeat. Wanted, it had read. A housekeeper. Must be able to read and write. The last part was for the ledgers, which were a mess of his own clumsy figuring, each number a testament to his slow slide toward ruin. He did not want to hire anyone. It felt like admitting Eleanor was truly gone, like papering over a hole in the wall instead of mending the timber. It felt like betrayal, but the ranch was failing, and so was he. He had no choice. The groan of the approaching stagecoach pulled him from his thoughts. It lumbered into the center of town, a cloud of alkali dust billowing in its wake. A few men lounging on the porch of the general store stirred, their interest piqued. The driver, a leather-faced man named Gus, hauled back on the reins with a string of curses for his tired horses. When the coach door swung open, the first person to emerge was a drummer in a dusty bowler hat, followed by a woman with 2 fretful children. Then, a young woman stepped down, and Silas knew it was her. She was smaller than he had imagined, slender and fine-boned, looking as if a gust of that Wyoming wind might carry her off. Her dress was a simple, dark calico, clean but faded from many washings. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the anxious set of her jaw. She clutched a single, small carpet bag and looked out at the harsh, sun-bleached street with wide, cautious eyes. He guessed her age at 23, maybe younger, a girl. Really. He saw a couple of the idlers on the porch exchange a smirk. One of them nudged the other, muttering something about a delicate little thing. As she stood there, her gaze sweeping the small clutch of buildings, her hand went unconsciously to her throat, her fingers closing around a small object tucked beneath her collar. It was a nervous gesture, one of a person used to being watched. Silas took a step forward, then hesitated. This felt wrong. He was a gnarled oak of a man, and she was a sapling. What life could she possibly have in his silent, grieving house, on a ranch the earth itself was trying to reclaim? Before he could speak, the world exploded into noise and confusion. 4 riders thundered down the street, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. They were not subtle. A pistol cracked. The shot fired into the air, sending pigeons scattering from the roof of the bank. The horses reared, screaming. The drummer dove behind a water trough. People scrambled for cover. "Nobody move a muscle," one of the riders bellowed, his voice unnaturally loud. "Theatrical! This is a message from Mr. Talbot. Debts are due." Silas's gut tightened. This was not a robbery. It was a performance. Royce Talbot, the town's banker and land speculator, owned half the territory, or aimed to. This was his way of reminding everyone who held the real power. Silas saw one of the riders yank a sack of flour from a farmer's wagon and slash it open, laughing as the white powder ghosted on the wind. It was petty cruelty, meant to humiliate, to break a man's spirit before breaking his back. In the midst of the panic, Silas saw the young woman, Mara Quinn, move with a startling calm. Her fear was visible. Her face was pale as milk, but it did not paralyze her. Her eyes darted around, assessing, thinking. She saw the two small children who had been on the stage, a boy and a girl, standing frozen with terror near their mother, who was trying to shield them. Mara moved toward them, her steps swift and quiet. She crouched down, speaking in a low, urgent murmur that Silas could not hear. She pointed to a large, empty shipping crate resting against the wall of the general store. The mother nodded frantically, with a gentle but firm pressure. Mara guided the two children into the crate, pulling a dusty canvas flap partially over the opening. She gave the little boy's shoulder a quick squeeze before backing away. It was done so quickly, so discreetly that the riders, busy with their swaggering threats, did not even notice. Then one of them, a burly man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, grabbed old Mrs. Gable, the preacher's widow, who was fumbling with the clasp of her reticule. "Hand it over." "Grandma," he snarled, his hand closing over her frail wrist. Something in Silas snapped. He was not a fighter. Not anymore. The brawling days of his youth were long gone, buried under years of hard labor and quiet living with Eleanor. But he could not stand by and watch this. He walked forward, placing himself between the man and Mrs. Gable. "That is enough," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the flat, hard authority of a decent man pushed too far. The scarred man turned. Surprised, he grinned, a nasty show of yellowed teeth. "Well now, look what we got here. Silas Boone, heard the drought's been thirsty at your place." He shoved Silas hard in the chest. "Maybe you ought to worry about your own business." Silas stumbled back but did not fall. "She is my business. This town is my business." The man's grin vanished. He swung a heavy-gloved fist, catching Silas on the side of the mouth. The blow sent a jolt of pain through his jaw, and he tasted the warm, metallic tang of blood. He staggered again, his head ringing. Just as the man raised his fist for another blow, a tremendous clatter erupted from the side of the street. Mara had shoved a tall, rickety stack of empty chicken coops. They toppled like dominoes, bouncing and rolling into the street with a racket that could wake the dead. The sudden noise was a shock. Everyone, including Silas's attacker, flinched and turned toward the sound. In that split second of confusion, Mrs. Gable scurried away to safety, and Silas had a moment to steady himself, shaking the stars from his vision. The scarred man spun back around, his face dark with fury. He saw Mara standing beside the fallen coops, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He started toward her, malice in every step. "You little meddler," he growled. As he closed the distance, her hand, which had been at her throat, dropped. The chain of a silver locket swung free, catching the harsh afternoon sun. It was an old piece, tarnished at the edges, with letters intricately engraved on its surface. The man stopped. He was only a few feet from her, close enough for Silas to see the sudden change in his expression. The anger drained away, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His eyes were fixed on the locket. He squinted, as if trying to place something from a long-forgotten dream. "MQT," he breathed, the words barely a whisper. He stared at her face, his gaze sharp and searching now, moving from her eyes to the shape of her jaw. He took a half-step back. The other riders, their charade complete, were already turning their horses. "Brand, let us go," one of them shouted. The man called Brand gave Mara one last, bewildered look, then shook his head as if to clear it. Without another word, he turned, swung himself into his saddle, and galloped after the others, leaving nothing behind but a lingering pall of dust and fear. The silence that descended was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. People slowly emerged from doorways and from behind wagons. The town marshal, a man whose primary duties involved sleeping in his office chair, finally appeared, looking flustered. Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing the blood. His eyes found Mara. She was helping the Fletcher children out of the crate, her movements as composed as ever. Their mother ran to them, weeping with relief and gratitude, hugging her children and then, impulsively, hugging Mara. "Thank you," the woman sobbed. "Oh, bless you, thank you." Mara simply patted the woman's arm, her own face a mask of weary composure. She seemed deeply uncomfortable with the attention, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. The town was looking at her now. The smirks of the men on the porch were gone. In their place were expressions of awe and respect. They had all seen it. They had seen the girl they'd dismissed as fragile stand up to Talbot's thugs with nothing more than quick wits and a stack of chicken coops. They had seen a courage that shamed their own inaction. Silas walked over to her, his split lip throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The dry, lonely wind still blew, but for the first time in a long time, it did not seem to be blowing straight through him. "You were brave," he said, his voice rough. She finally looked up at him, her eyes a startling shade of gray, like a sky before a storm. She took in his cut lip, the trickle of blood on his chin. "So were you." Her voice was soft, but clear. She glanced around at the watching townspeople and then back at him, a question in her eyes. "Are you Mr. Silas Boone?" "I am," he said. He had come to town to hire a housekeeper. He had found something else entirely. He found a woman who could stand steady in the wind, a woman who carried a secret on a silver chain, a woman whose quiet strength had just echoed through the entire dusty heart of Dry Willow. And as he looked at her, the guilt he felt about Eleanor did not vanish, but it was joined by a new and unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of hope, as small and as stubborn as the first green shoot after a long drought. The journey to Boone Ranch was made in near silence, the only sounds the rhythmic plodding of the horse and the creak of the wagon wheels. The land stretched out on all sides, a vast, sun-scorched canvas of brown and pale yellow under a sky of searing blue. Mara Quinn sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze taking in the unforgiving landscape. She saw the skeletons of cattle half buried in the dust and the heat shimmering off the baked earth. It was a place that did not offer comfort easily. Silas Boone held the reins, his eyes on the horizon, his jaw set. The sting in his lip was a dull throb, a minor pain compared to the turmoil in his mind. He had seen the way the townsfolk looked at Mara after the incident, with a respect she had earned in a few terrifying minutes. But he had also seen the pity in their eyes when they looked at him, Silas Boone, bringing home a housekeeper barely older than a girl. He could already hear the whispers starting. He had offered her the position not as a job, but as a temporary sanctuary. "You ought to rest up after your journey, and all that commotion," he had said back in town, his voice low. "My ranch is not much, but it is quiet. You can stay on as housekeeper for a spell. I will pay a fair wage, and I can teach you to ride a horse proper." He laid out his terms with a stark, simple honesty. "There is to be respect between us. There are no other bindings. You are free to leave whenever you wish, no questions asked." Mara had simply nodded, her relief so profound it was almost a visible thing. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she had said. "That is more than fair." Now, as they crested a low rise, he pointed with his chin. "That is it." The ranch was nestled in a shallow dip, a small wooden house and a barn leaning against the wind. From a distance, it looked like a place of refuge. Up close, it looked like a place that was tired of fighting. The porch sagged on one end. The whitewash on the house had peeled away to bare gray wood, and the fence line that marked the corral had several broken rails. It was a property that mirrored the man who owned it, weathered, stoic, and carrying the scars of a long, hard struggle. He led her inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disuse. A fine layer of it coated every surface, the furniture stark and masculine. In the main room, a large stone fireplace stood cold and empty. a stack of unread newspapers yellowing on the hearth. He saw the space through her eyes for the first time in years. He saw the loneliness of it, the lack of a woman's touch that had once made it a home. "Your room is this way," he said, his voice gruff. He led her to a small chamber off the main room. It held a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the parched yard. "It is not much." "It is fine," she replied softly, placing her single bag on the floor. It was the beginning of her new life, a single bag in a dusty room in the middle of nowhere. The days that followed fell into a quiet, difficult rhythm. Silas was gone from before dawn until long after dusk. He was a man locked in a losing war with his own land. The well was desperately low, each bucket of water he hauled up seeming thinner and more precious than the last. He spent his days mending the endless miles of fence, his hands raw and bleeding, or tending to the small herd of cattle that had survived the drought. They were gaunt, their hides loose, their eyes dull with sickness. Each one that died was another nail in the ranch's coffin. He was a man of few words, and his grief was a wall around him. At the supper table, he ate with a focused intensity, his exhaustion a heavy cloak. He answered her questions about the ranch with brief, factual statements, never volunteering more. He was not unkind, but he was distant, a ghost in his own home. Mara, in her quiet way, began to push back against the tide of neglect. She started in the kitchen, a room that had seen nothing but grease and despair for 2 years. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows until they sparkled, and coaxed the old cast-iron stove back to life. Soon, the house began to smell of baking bread and simmering stew, aromas that had been absent for so long they seemed foreign. She found his mending basket, the clothes overflowing with rips and missing buttons, and set to work with a needle and thread, her stitches small and perfect. She even climbed onto the roof one afternoon with a bucket of tar Silas had in the barn and patched a leak over the kitchen, a task he had been meaning to do for a year. She did not ask for permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Her presence was a quiet hum of efficiency, a gentle force of order in his chaotic world. One morning, she found a small patch of earth near the house where the soil seemed a little darker, a little less defeated. She took a spade and began to turn it over, her movements careful and determined. She had found a small cloth bag of seeds in her carpet bag, and she planted them in neat rows, hardy cabbages, turnips, and beans. It was an act of stubborn faith, a belief that something could still grow in this thirsty land. Silas watched her from a distance sometimes, a strange feeling twisting in his chest. She moved with a purpose that reminded him so much of Eleanor, and the comparison was a sharp pain. He would find himself staring at his left hand, at the simple gold band he had never taken off. It felt heavy, a circle of memory and guilt. He had loved his wife. He still did. Having another woman in her house, sleeping in a room just down the hall. Planting a garden where Eleanor's roses used to be, it felt like a violation, a slow erasure of the life they had built. He would clench his fist, the metal digging into his skin, and force the feeling down. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. Mara, for her part, held herself with a guarded stillness. She moved through the house as if she were a guest, careful not to take up too much space. She rarely met his gaze directly, her eyes often fixed on her hands or on some distant point outside the window. He sensed a deep-seated fear in her, a wariness of men and their expectations. He had promised her there would be no bindings, and he meant to keep that promise. He did not want a wife, he wanted his Eleanor back. And Mara clearly did not want a husband. She wanted a safe place to be. The evenings were the hardest. The silence in the small house would press in, magnifying the sound of the ceaseless wind outside. After one particularly grueling day, Silas slumped into his chair by the empty fireplace, the weariness in his bones so deep it felt like an illness. Mara came in from the kitchen, holding a small, worn book. She hesitated in the doorway. "Would you mind if I read for a while, Mr. Boone?" she asked, aloud. "I mean, it helps me to hear the words." Silas grunted, which he intended as an affirmation. He expected her to sit far away, but she took the small stool near the hearth. She opened the book, her slim fingers tracing the title on the page. In the dim lamplight. He saw it was a volume of poems by Longfellow. Her voice, when she began to read, was low and clear, with a soft, melodic cadence. It was a voice that did not demand attention, but invited it. She read of villages and blacksmiths, of ships and winter nights. The words filled the silent room, pushing back the loneliness, softening the hard edges of his day. It was not Eleanor's voice. It was calmer, more reserved, and for some reason, that made it bearable. It was not a replacement. It was something new. He closed his eyes and just listened, letting the rhythm of the verses wash over him. It was the first moment of peace he had felt in a very long time. A few weeks later, their supply of flour ran low, and Silas had no choice but to make the trip into Dry Willow. He asked Mara if she needed anything. She gave him a short list written in a neat, elegant script thread, a packet of salt, and a bar of lye soap. When he entered the general store, Hester Pike was behind the counter. She was a woman whose currency was gossip, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Silas," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How are things out at the ranch? I imagine it is a lot less lonely these days." Silas kept his face impassive. "I need a sack of flour, Hester, and some coffee." She bustled about, gathering his items, her questions buzzing around him like horseflies. "And how is your little housekeeper settling in such a brave thing?" What she did. "And so young. A man gets tired of his own cooking, does he not? It is good you have someone to look after you." Every word was a carefully placed barb. He could feel the judgment of the entire town funneled through this one woman. He paid for his goods, his movements stiff with anger. As he was leaving, he heard her speaking to another customer in a conspiratorial whisper. It takes a certain kind of man to bring a girl that young into a dead wife's home. The rumor was planted. Silas Boone had not hired a housekeeper. He had taken in a replacement. The ride home was grim. The injustice of it all churned in his gut. He was trying to survive. Mara was trying to survive. But people like Hester Pike saw only what their small, suspicious minds wanted to see. He was unloading the wagon when a rider approached, kicking up a plume of dust. Silas recognized the horse first, a fine bay gelding. The rider was Royce Talbot, dressed in a tailored suit that looked ridiculously out of place on the dusty prairie. He dismounted, dusting off his trousers with a gloved hand. "Boone," he said with a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "I was in the area. Thought I would stop by and see how you are faring." Talbot's gaze swept over the ranch, taking in the sick cattle and the dry well with an appraiser's clinical detachment. His eyes lingered for a moment on the small patch of green that was Mara's garden. "Times are tough," he continued, his tone sympathetic. "I know that, and I am a reasonable man." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. The banknote. "It is coming due at the end of the month. I know you do not have the cash. This land. It has been a burden to you, a struggle. Perhaps it is time to let it go." "What are you saying?" Talbot Silas asked, his voice flat. "I am saying I am prepared to make you an offer. Sign the deed over to me. I will cancel the debt. You can walk away, free and clear. A man could start over somewhere else, somewhere with more rain." The offer hung in the air, slick and venomous. It was not a lifeline. It was a noose. Talbot did not want to help him. He wanted his land, his water rights, his dignity. He wanted to pick the bones of Silas's failure. Silas looked from Talbot's smug face to the house he had built with Eleanor, to the barn that held so many memories. He thought of the small garden Mara had planted, a tiny rebellion of life against the encroaching death. "The answer is no," Silas said. Talbot's smile tightened. "Have it your way, Boone. But the note is still due." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Silas standing in the yard, the afternoon sun beating down on his head. He held the notice in his hand, the paper feeling as heavy as a stone. From the doorway of the house, Mara watched him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear he now knew they both shared. The quiet truce they had built was over. The enemy was no longer a distant threat, but a name on a piece of paper that could take everything from them. Royce Talbot's visit left a poison in the air, a sense of a clock ticking down to a final, unavoidable ruin. The pressure settled on the ranch like the dust, silent and suffocating. 2 days later, the threat took on a new, more brutal form. Silas discovered it at dawn, a cold dread coiling in his stomach when he saw the northern fence line. The wires had been cut, the posts kicked down. He rode the perimeter, his eyes scanning the herd that was scattered and spooked. He counted them once, then twice, his heart sinking with each pass. 12 were gone. The rustlers had been quiet and efficient, moving under the cover of darkness. They had not just taken the cattle, they had altered the brands on a few they left behind. A messy, deliberate act of vandalism meant to confuse and demoralize. The new marks were crude slashes over his simple B, turning it into something ugly and unrecognizable. He rode into Dry Willow with a storm brewing behind his eyes. He found Deputy Sheriff Keats sweeping the boardwalk in front of his office, an activity Keats seemed to prefer over any actual law enforcement. Keats was a man who had grown soft in the middle and timid in the soul, a placid creature wholly unsuited to the sharp edges of the territory. "They cut my wire," Silas said, his voice hard as iron. "Took 12 head." Keats stopped sweeping and leaned on his broom, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Rustlers. Well now, Silas, that is a terrible business. A terrible business. You sure they did not just wander off? That fence of yours is not in the best shape." "They were taken. Keats, the brands on some of the remaining stock are defaced." The deputy sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if Silas had just presented him with a problem too complex for any mortal man to solve. "Well, I can file a report. But you know how it is. This is big country. Those cattle could be halfway to Nebraska by now. And with no witnesses," he let the sentence hang in the air, a shrug in verbal form. "This has Talbot stink all over it," Silas said, lowering his voice. "He was here 2 days ago." Keats' eyes widened slightly, and he took a step back. "Now, Silas, let us not go making wild accusations. Royce Talbot is a respectable businessman, a pillar of this community. You have no proof of that. You are upset, and that is understandable. But you cannot go around blaming folks like Mr. Talbot." Silas looked at the man, at his weak chin and his shifty gaze, and saw the truth. Keats was not just incompetent, he was afraid. He was another one of Talbot's assets, as surely as the loans in his bank vault. Silas turned without another word and walked away, the futility of it all a bitter taste in his mouth. There was no law here. There was only Talbot. He returned to the ranch in a state of quiet despair. He unsaddled his horse, his movements heavy. Mara was waiting on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand for him. She saw the look on his face and did not ask what had happened. She already knew. "The deputy will do nothing," he said, taking the cup. Her presence was a small comfort, but the problem was a mountain, and he was a man with a shovel. "They will come back," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the lowing of the remaining cattle. Then Mara spoke again, her voice soft but surprisingly firm. "Your brand? The B? It is too simple. A rustler can change it to an 8 or add a line to make it an R." Silas looked at her, startled. He had never considered that. Eleanor had designed the brand, sketching it on a piece of paper one evening years ago. It was a part of her, and the thought of changing it felt like another betrayal. "We could design a new one," Mara continued, her gaze steady. "Something harder to alter. Maybe a bee inside a circle, or a lazy bee with a tail. And we should not graze them in the north pasture for a while. It is too exposed. We could move them to the box canyon at night. It is more defensible." He stared at her, a flicker of astonishment cutting through his anger. He was the rancher. He was the one who was supposed to know these things. Yet here was this quiet, reserved woman who had spent her life with books and needlepoint, laying out a practical, intelligent strategy for survival. He had hired a housekeeper, a woman to manage the domestic sphere he had let fall to ruin. He had not expected a partner. "That is a good idea," he admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. The next day, Silas spent the morning at his forge, the clang of hammer on iron a furious release of his frustration. He worked out a new design, a bee with a curving, horizontal bar across the top, like a breaking wave. It was complex enough to be difficult to change. It was his now, not Eleanor's. The thought came with a pang of guilt, but also a sliver of something else, a sense of moving forward, however painful. A few days later, Mara rode into town for supplies. As she was leaving the general store, a voice called her name. It was Royce Talbot, leaning against the post of the bank, looking as cool and unruffled as a snake in the shade. "Miss Quinn," he said, tipping his hat, "a pleasure to see you. I trust you are finding our little town to your liking." "It is quiet," she said, her hand tightening on her basket. Talbot smiled. "Quiet can be good, but it does not pay the bills. I understand you are a woman of some education. A rare thing out here. A waste, really, for you to be mending fences and scrubbing floors for a man who is about to lose everything he has." Mara said nothing, her eyes like chips of slate. "I have a position open at the bank," he went on, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "A clerk, someone to handle my correspondence. The pay is excellent, more than enough for a young woman to make her own way. To be independent, I would even be willing to assist with Mr. Boone's financial troubles, as a gesture of goodwill." The offer was a silken trap. He was asking her to abandon a sinking ship and join the pirate who had scuttled it. He was trying to buy her loyalty, to turn her into another one of his possessions. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Talbot," she said, her voice perfectly even. "But I am not looking for a new position." She walked away, her back straight, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her hurry. But her heart was pounding. Silas saw them talking from the far end of the street, where he was negotiating with the blacksmith for a better price on iron. He saw the way Talbot leaned in, the confident smile on his face. He saw Mara standing before him, listening. He did not see her walk away. He turned back to the blacksmith, a cold knot of suspicion forming in his gut. That evening at supper, the silence was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of two people sharing a space, but the tense, brittle silence of unspoken thoughts. "You spoke with Talbot today," Silas said finally, not looking at her. Mara flinched almost imperceptibly. "He stopped me outside the store, and he offered me a job at the bank." Silas put his fork down. He looked at her now, his eyes hard. He saw the flicker of fear in her expression, and in his raw, wounded state. He misinterpreted it as guilt. He imagined her weighing the offer, considering a life of comfort and security against the hopeless squalor of his ranch. The thought that she might even think about it felt like a betrayal. "I see," he said, his voice flat and cold. He pushed his chair back and stood up. "I have chores to do." He left her sitting alone at the table, the food on her plate untouched, a chasm of misunderstanding opening between them. The sandstorm began the next day. It started as a yellow haze on the horizon, a smudge against the blue sky. The wind, which had been a constant, weary sigh for months, began to keen, a rising, mournful sound. By late afternoon, the world outside their windows had disappeared. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind a swirling wall of sand and grit. The wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames and forcing fine dust through every crack in the house. Silas was in the barn, securing the doors. when he heard a faint, distressed cry. It was one of the cows, one of the few who was still healthy enough to be pregnant. She had gone into labor. He cursed the timing. A birth in this maelstrom was a death sentence. Mara appeared at his side, a lantern in her hand, her hair covered by a shawl. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs and tried to tear the lantern from her grasp. "I will help," she shouted over the roar of the storm. For the next few hours, they worked together in the dim swirling light of the lantern. The air was thick with the smell of hay, animals, and the fine, choking dust. The cow was struggling, exhausted and weak. The calf was breech. There was no time to fetch a neighbor, even if they could have made it through the storm. "Hold her head," Silas commanded, his voice tight with concentration. He had done this 100 times, but never like this, with the world trying to tear itself apart outside. Mara did as she was told, murmuring soft, soothing words to the distressed animal. They were a team, their earlier conflict forgotten in the face of the immediate, desperate struggle for life. Silas worked carefully, his big hands surprisingly gentle. Finally, with a great effort from the cow and Silas's expert guidance, the calf was born, a slick, trembling creature. It was small, but it was alive. They worked to clean it, rubbing it down with rough burlap sacks to stimulate its breathing. As Mara reached to clear the calf's nostrils, a gust of wind tore through a gap in the barn wall, making the lantern swing wildly. In the shifting light, her sleeve, which had been pushed up to her elbow, fell down, and Silas saw it. On the pale, delicate skin of her inner wrist was a scar. It was not an accidental mark from a farming tool or a hot stove. It was a thin, white, puckered line, old and faded, but unmistakable. It was the kind of mark left by a rope or a chain, pulled tight long ago. His eyes met hers. He saw a flash of something in their gray depths, something ancient and hunted. She pulled her sleeve down with a swift, jerky motion, her face closing off, becoming a shuttered house. She turned her attention back to the calf, her movements suddenly brisk and businesslike, leaving his unspoken question hanging in the dusty air between them. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world remade in shades of brown. A thick blanket of sand covered everything, smoothing sharp edges, burying fences, and filling troughs. The new calf, sheltered in the barn, was alive. A small, stubborn miracle. The shared crisis had papered over the crack between them, but the scar he had seen, and the misunderstanding that preceded it, remained just beneath the surface, like truths buried by the sand. That night, with the wind finally quiet, Mara sat at the kitchen table, the ranch's ledgers spread out before her. Silas had handed them over with a sigh of resignation. "I cannot make heads or tails of them anymore," he had said. "Maybe you can." Under the steady glow of the oil lamp, she examined the papers from Talbot's bank, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the columns of figures with her finger, her lips moving silently as she calculated. She picked up the original loan agreement and read the fine print, her eyes narrowing. Then she saw it. It was not a single, obvious deception. It was a series of small, predatory clauses, an interest rate that compounded not annually but monthly, a late fee that was a staggering percentage of the principal, a fee for account maintenance. She cross-referenced the dates on the agreement with the payment receipts Silas had kept. She saw the discrepancies, the way payments had been applied to these manufactured fees before they ever touched the loan itself. The ink on some of the receipts was a slightly different shade, the signature a little too perfect, as if it had been traced. It was a spider's web, expertly woven. Silas had not been failing because of the drought or his own mismanagement. He had been bled dry, slowly and deliberately, by Royce Talbot's pen. A cold, clear anger settled over her, displacing the fear and uncertainty. She had been a victim her whole life, of whispers and poverty and the circumstances of her birth. She would not be a victim now. She closed the ledger. She would not confront Talbot. Not yet. She would gather her proof, piece by piece in the shadows. The girl who had hidden children in a crate and toppled chicken coops to create a distraction had found her new purpose. She would fight this battle not with fists or guns, but with paper and ink, the only weapon she had ever truly mastered. The discovery of Talbot's calculated thievery did not bring relief, only a sharper, colder kind of fear. Mara kept her knowledge a secret, a small, hard stone she carried inside her. To speak of it now, without irrefutable proof, would be to invite disaster. Silas was already a wounded animal, and she would not provoke the wolf circling his territory until she had a proper weapon in her hand. The tension between them had eased since the sandstorm, the shared fight for the calf's life forming a fragile bridge over the chasm of his misunderstanding. Yet, a new quietness settled in, one of preoccupation. Silas was consumed by the looming deadline of the banknote, while Mara spent every spare moment poring over the ledgers, her mind a quiet flurry of calculations and plans. Hope, however, arrived from an unexpected quarter. It came in the form of Jedediah Firth, a neighboring rancher with a face like a dried apple and a spirit as tough as leather. He rode over one morning with two of his sons, their expressions grim. "The creek is almost gone, Silas," Jedediah announced without preamble, "but there is still a trickle coming down from the high country. If we dig a ditch, a proper deep one, from the upper bend, we might be able to divert enough to fill our cisterns, at least for the livestock. It is too big a job for one family, but for 3 or 4. The idea was a spark in a dry field, a community irrigation ditch. It was a desperate, back-breaking plan, but it was a plan. Within a day, the word had spread. The Schmidts, a German family from the next section over, arrived with their 2 stout sons and a heavy plow. The Firths returned, and even a few single men who worked claims in the foothills came down, drawn by the promise of shared labor and a chance to fight back against the relentless drought. It was a small army armed with shovels and picks, their faces set with determination. Mara insisted on working alongside them. Silas tried to object. "This is men's work. Mara, the sun is brutal." She just looked at him, a glint of steel in her gray eyes. "The sun is the same for all of us, Mr. Boone. And my arms are as willing as anyone's." She proved to be as good as her word. She could not lift the heavy rocks or swing a pick with the force of the men, but she found her own rhythm. She shoveled the loose dirt the others broke free, her movements economical and tireless. She hauled buckets of water from the ranch house for the thirsty workers and organized the midday meal of bread and salted pork, ensuring everyone had their share. The other men, at first skeptical, soon came to respect her quiet tenacity. They saw that she was not a fragile doll, but a woman made of the same resilient fiber as their own wives and daughters. Silas watched her, a slow, deep current of admiration moving through him. He saw the way she pushed a stray strand of honey-colored hair from her forehead with the back of a dusty wrist, leaving a smear of dirt across her brow. He saw the set of her jaw as she focused on her task, her slight frame seeming to possess an impossible wellspring of energy. She worked without complaint, her presence a steady, quiet inspiration. They toiled for 3 days under the merciless Wyoming sun. The work was brutal, a slow, agonizing clawing at the hard, unforgiving earth. Muscles screamed, hands bled, and sweat soaked their clothes, leaving white salt stains as it dried. But as the ditch deepened, inch by painstaking inch, a sense of shared purpose grew among them. They were no longer isolated families fighting their own desperate battles. They were a community, their sweat mingling in the dust, their hopes converging in that single, muddy channel. On the evening of the 3rd day, they finally broke through the last stretch of rock and clay. A cheer went up as the first sluggish trickle of brown water began to snake its way down the newly dug trench. It was not a river, not even a stream, but it was water. It was life. Exhausted and filthy, but with a sense of profound triumph, The group gathered near the wagon as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Mrs. Firth had brought a jug of fresh buttermilk, and they passed it around, each person taking a long, grateful swallow. Mara sat on an overturned bucket, trying to discreetly wipe her hands on her skirt. They were a mess. The soft skin of her palms rubbed raw, with angry red blisters and several small cuts that were weeping blood. She had never performed such hard, physical labor in her life, and her body ached in places she did not know she had. Silas saw her wince as she flexed her fingers. He walked over and stood before her, his large frame blocking out the last of the setting sun. "Let me see," he said, his voice low and gentle. She hesitated, a flush rising on her cheeks. "It is nothing, just a few scrapes." He did not argue. He simply reached down and took her right hand in his. He held it carefully, his calloused, work-hardened fingers surprisingly tender as he turned it over to examine her palm. His thumb brushed lightly over a broken blister, and she flinched. He saw the damage the shovel handle had done, the delicate skin torn and bleeding. A strange, protective ache moved through his chest. These were the hands that had brought order to his house, that had stitched his shirts and planted a garden of hope. He looked at her tired face smudged with dirt, at the exhaustion in her gray eyes, and in that moment, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He felt something shift inside him, a wall of grief and loneliness that he had carefully maintained for 2 years beginning to crumble. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand. It was not a kiss of passion, but something deeper, quieter. It was a gesture of profound respect, of gratitude, of a tenderness he thought had died with Eleanor. The touch of his lips on her skin was warm and soft, a stark contrast to the harshness of the day, the land, the life they were living. Mara's breath hitched. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a shy, dawning wonder. A playful light sparked in their depths, a glint of the spirit she so often kept hidden. It was her way of deflecting a feeling so intense it threatened to overwhelm her. She teased in a whisper, "A thread of sound just for him. Keep it." A slow smile spread across Silas's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes, and he did. He did not let go. His fingers remained intertwined with hers, his hand enveloping hers in a warm, secure grasp. A soft, shared laugh escaped them both, a sound of surprised, awkward, undeniable connection. It was a private moment, a small bubble of warmth in the cool evening air. But it was not entirely private. Across the way, Hester Pike, who had arrived late with a basket of what she claimed were freshly baked biscuits, saw the whole exchange. Her eyes narrowed, her lips thinning into a disapproving line. She saw not tenderness, but impropriety. She saw not respect, but a widower taking liberties with his young, vulnerable housekeeper. The story was already writing itself in her mind, a tale far more scandalous and interesting than the simple truth. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence was now filled with the echo of that shared laugh. With the lingering warmth of his hand holding hers, the space between them on the wagon seat seemed smaller, charged with a new and unspoken awareness. That evening, after a supper eaten in near silence, Silas finally broke the charged atmosphere. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace he had taken to lighting each night. "I saw Hester Pike watching us. He said, by tomorrow, the whole town will be talking." Mara said nothing, her hands busy with a piece of mending. She knew what he meant. She had lived her whole life in the shadow of whispers. "It is not right," he continued, his voice rough with an emotion she could not quite decipher. "What they will say. It is not fair to you, or to Eleanor's memory." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "I loved my wife, Mara. When she died, I thought the best part of me died with her. I kept this house like a tomb for 2 years because I felt like if I changed anything, if I let any light in, it would mean I was forgetting her. It felt like a betrayal." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Having you here, it has been difficult. Every time I see you in the kitchen or hear you reading by the fire, there is a part of me that feels a terrible guilt. But there is another part, a part I have been fighting, that feels grateful. You brought this house back to life, and I think, maybe, you have started to do the same for me." His honesty was a raw, vulnerable thing. It invited the same from her. She put down her sewing, her hands still in her lap. "People have always whispered about me," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear it. "My whole life." She reached up and touched the silver locket at her throat. "My mother was not married to my father. He was a horse trader named Tobias Quinn. That is what the T stands for. He gave this to my mother before he rode away and never came back. She died when I was very young. I grew up in an orphanage, and then, as a charity case, in a minister's house. I was always the girl from nowhere, the one with no name to speak of, the base-born child." She finally met his gaze, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "The things Hester Pike will say. I have been hearing versions of them since I was old enough to understand. It is why I came out here. I thought in a new place, a place where no one knew me. I could be judged for what I do, not for what I am." She gave a small, humorless smile. "And it is why no one has ever offered a proposal. Who would want to marry a girl with a past like mine?" Silas looked at her, at the immense courage it took for her to tell him her story. He saw not shame, but a strength that humbled him. "Nobody is perfect out here. Mara," he said, his voice thick, "we are all just a collection of our scars and our mistakes. We are just trying to live right." A flicker of her wry humor returned. "I am just trying to live with enough water," she said, the corners of her mouth twitching. The small joke broke the tension, and they both smiled. He looked at her, this remarkable, resilient woman who had faced down Talbot's thugs, a sandstorm, and a lifetime of scorn. He saw his future, not as a replacement for his past, but as a continuation of it, a new chapter. "Stay on, Mara," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not as a housekeeper. Stay on, as family. This ranch, it needs you. I need you. And when you are ready, when this business with Talbot is settled, we will marry." It was not a question, but a statement of intent, a promise. He was offering her not just a home, but his name, the very thing she had never had. Mara's heart swelled with an emotion so powerful it almost stole her breath. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a place to belong, a person to belong with. But she looked over at the small table where the ledgers lay, a silent testament to the battle that still lay ahead. Talbot still held the power of ruin over them. To accept Silas's offer now would be to tether her future to a ship that was still taking on water. She looked back at him, her eyes clear and resolute. "First," she said softly, "we have to save this ranch." Silas's proposal hung between them, a promise of a future that was still balanced on a knife's edge. Mara's decision to wait, to fight for the ranch first, did not create distance. Instead, it forged a new kind of partnership, a silent understanding that their individual survival was now inextricably linked. While Silas worked the land with a renewed, almost feverish energy, Mara's mind was fixed on the bank. The ledgers were a puzzle, and she was missing the final pieces, the ones that were locked away in Roy C. Talbot's office. Her opportunity came in a way she never expected. Talbot's regular clerk, a prim man named Mr. Abernathy, came down with a lung fever, panicked about his correspondence and accounts falling behind, and with a characteristic arrogance that made him underestimate everyone. Talbot remembered the quiet, literate woman from Boone's ranch. He sent word offering her a day's wage, a generous one, to come in and sort a backlog of shipping manifests. It was a tedious, dusty job, one he considered beneath him. He believed he was buying a day of her labor. He had no idea she intended to steal his secrets. The Dry Willow Bank was a small, imposing building of brick and false confidence. Inside, it smelled of stale cigar smoke, ink, and money. Talbot set Mara up at a small desk in the corner, a mountain of paperwork before her. His main ledger, the one containing the town's financial soul, lay on his large oak desk, just a few feet away. For hours, Mara worked diligently, her head bent, her pen scratching across the manifests. She was a model of quiet efficiency. She felt Talbot's eyes on her from time to time, a cold, speculative gaze. He was watching a mouse, unaware it was studying the architecture of his trap. Her chance came at midday. Talbot was called away to the telegraph office for an urgent message from Cheyenne. "Do not touch anything on my desk. Miss Quinn," he said, his voice a casual command. "I will not be long." The moment the door closed behind him, she moved. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Her hands, however, were steady. She went to his desk, her eyes scanning the room for the storage closet where he kept his past records. It was a heavy wooden door with a simple lock. During the morning, she had watched him unlock it to retrieve an old file. The key, a plain brass one he took from his top desk drawer. She found it easily, with trembling fingers. She unlocked the storeroom, the click of the mechanism sounding as loud as a gunshot in the silent bank. Inside, the air was musty and thick with the scent of aging paper. Ledgers were stacked on shelves, a library of financial bondage. She found the ones for the past 3 years. She had no time to take them, no way to smuggle them out. She had to copy the information. She had come prepared, with a small notebook and a pencil tucked into her dress pocket. With frantic, precise movements, she began to write. She transcribed the entries for Silas Boone, for the Firths, for the Schmidts. She found what she was looking for, the evidence of compounded interest illegally applied, of fees invented from whole cloth. She saw the signatures on loan extensions, signatures she knew were forgeries because the dates corresponded to times Silas had been laid up with a broken leg, unable to even travel to town. The different shades of ink, the slightly shaky lines on the counterfeit signatures. It was all there. It was the proof she needed. She was just finishing when she heard the bell on the front door jingle. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She shoved the notebook into her pocket, locked the storeroom, and slid the key back into the drawer just as Talbot walked back in. She was sitting at her own desk, her breathing ragged. When he turned to look at her, he saw nothing but a meek clerk, diligently at work. The ride home was a blur of triumph and terror. She had the evidence. The knowledge was a fire in her veins. She had to tell Silas. She urged the horse on, her mind racing. She took a shortcut across the old salt flats, a desolate, white expanse where nothing grew. The air was still and heavy, the silence absolute. That was when she saw the rider. He was waiting for her in the middle of the flats, a lone, dark figure against the stark white ground. As he approached, she recognized him. It was the man from the staged robbery, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, Brand Coyle. He reined in his horse, blocking her path. His eyes, cold and flat as a snake's, roamed over her, and he smiled a slow, ugly smile. "Leaving town in a hurry, little bird," he said, his voice a low growl. "I have business at home," Mara replied, trying to keep her own voice steady. Coyle chuckled. "I think your business is with me, the boss, Mr. Talbot. He does not like people who are too curious. He does not like people who poke their noses into his ledgers." Mara's blood ran cold. He knew. They knew. Coyle's gaze dropped to her throat, to the silver locket that rested against her collarbone. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "I remember that trinket," he said softly. "I remember it from a long time ago." He looked back at her face, a slow, dawning recognition in his eyes. He let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be the bastard child of Tobias Quinn. The name, spoken aloud by this brutal man in this empty place, struck Mara with the force of a physical blow. Tobias used to ride with us, Coyle went on, his voice laced with a strange mix of contempt and nostalgia. He was a horse trader. All right, he traded horses that belonged to other people, but he had a falling out with the boss. Got greedy. Thought he could cheat Mr. Talbot on a big score. The old man paid for that mistake. And now, it looks like his daughter is going to pay for it all over again. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was not just about the ranch. This was a vendetta. Talbot's cruelty was not just business. It was personal. He was not just trying to ruin Silas. He was trying to bury the last living piece of a man who had betrayed him. "Get off my land," Coyle snarled, his voice suddenly vicious. "You and the widower. You have until the end of the month. After that, things get ugly." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving Mara alone on the white, silent plain, the truth a more crushing weight than any physical threat. She rode the rest of the way home in a daze. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, was now turning a strange, bruised purple on the horizon. The wind was picking up, and it carried a new and unfamiliar chill. An early winter was coming. By the time she reached the ranch, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, thick, wet flakes that melted the moment they hit the ground. She found Silas in the barn, his face a grim mask of worry. I told him. "Mara," he said, his voice heavy with a new despair. "I told Silas everything. The forgeries, the fees, the notebook in her pocket." He listened, his expression shifting from confusion to a slow, burning rage. He took the notebook from her, his big hands turning the small pages with a strange reverence. "You did this?" he whispered, looking at her with an awe that made her blush. "You faced him down and found this." Before she could answer, the full force of the storm hit. The wind rose to a shrieking howl, and the snow, no longer melting, began to drive down in a blinding horizontal sheet. It was a blizzard, a white fury that descended without warning. "I have to check the herd," Silas yelled over the wind. "They will drift with the storm and scatter." "Wait, Silas, it is too dangerous." But he was already gone, pulling his heavy sheepskin coat on and heading for his horse. Mara watched from the barn door as he disappeared into the swirling vortex of white. An hour passed, then two. The snow piled up in deep drifts against the barn and house. The world was a maelstrom of wind and ice. Silas did not return. A terrible fear, colder than the wind, began to grip Mara. He was out there, alone, in that chaos. She could not just wait. She saddled the mare she had been learning to ride, her fingers numb and clumsy with cold. She wrapped a thick wool scarf around her face and rode out into the storm, calling his name, her voice swallowed by the wind. She quickly became lost. Every landmark was gone, buried under a blanket of white. The snow stung her eyes, and the wind cut through her clothes. She was disoriented, terrified. The mare, spooked and unsure, stumbled, throwing Mara into a deep drift. The horse, panicked, bolted into the whiteout. Mara was alone, on foot, and freezing. She curled into a ball, the cold seeping into her bones, her hope beginning to fade. She did not know how long she had been there when she heard it. A faint shout, almost lost in the storm. "Mara." She tried to answer, but her voice was a hoarse croak. She struggled to her feet and saw him, a dark shape on horseback, appearing like a phantom out of the swirling snow. Silas reached her, swinging down from his horse. He grabbed her, his face a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. "What were you thinking?" he roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "You could have died." "I thought you—" she stammered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. He did not let her finish. He swept her up in his arms and put her on his horse, climbing up behind her. He pulled his heavy sheepskin coat from his own shoulders and wrapped it around her, enveloping her in its warmth. The coat smelled of leather, wool, and Silas himself. She burrowed into it, her freezing body slowly, painfully beginning to thaw. He found a small, shallow cave carved into the side of a rocky outcrop, just enough to shelter them and the horse from the worst of the wind. They huddled together in the darkness, the storm raging outside. He held her close, his arms a circle of strength around her, sharing his body heat. They did not speak. There were no words for the terror they had just shared, or for the profound comfort of this small, desperate sanctuary. In the snow outside the cave mouth, their footprints, his large and hers small, had been laid one on top of the other, a single path leading to this shared shelter. They stayed there until dawn, when the storm finally broke. Leaving a world of pristine, silent white, the ride back to the ranch was slow, the new snow deep and heavy. They were both exhausted, bone-weary, but they were alive, and they had the proof. As soon as they had tended to the animals, Silas took Mara's notebook. "There is no more waiting," he said, his jaw set like granite. "I am taking this to Keats. The law has to do something now." He rode into town, the small notebook tucked safely inside his coat. Mara watched him go, a sense of foreboding chilling her despite the bright morning sun. Silas found Deputy Keats in his office, nursing a cup of coffee. He laid the notebook on the desk, his voice clear and steady as he explained what Mara had found. He pointed out the forged signatures, the fraudulent fees, the calculated pattern of theft. "This is your proof," Silas finished, his finger tapping the notebook. "This is everything you need to arrest Talbot." Keats picked up the notebook. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. He looked not at Silas, but at the wall behind him. A long, tense silence filled the small office. Then Keats closed the notebook. He stood up and walked to the door, locking it. He turned back to Silas, and for the first time, Silas saw something other than weakness in the man's eyes. He saw a cold, hard complicity. "This is a serious accusation, Silas," Keats said, his voice flat. "Stealing private bank records. That is a crime." "What are you talking about?" Silas asked, confusion turning to disbelief. "That is the evidence." "This," Keats said, holding up the notebook, "is a stolen document, and Mr. Talbot has already filed a complaint against you." He looked Silas straight in the eye. "Silas Boone, you are under arrest." He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his drawer. The hope that had sustained Silas through the blizzard, the hope that had been born in a small, handwritten notebook, turned to ash in his mouth. The law was not his shield. It was Talbot's weapon, and it was pointed directly at his heart. The news of Silas's arrest reached the ranch like a death knell. Jedediah Firth's youngest son brought the word, his face pale and his voice hushed, as if speaking of a blasphemy. Mara listened, her hands clutching the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. The world tilted, the solid ground of hope she had so carefully built crumbling into dust. The notebook, their only weapon, had been turned against them. The law itself had become the instrument of their destruction. For a long, desolate hour, she sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the silence a crushing weight. Despair was a familiar country, a place she had lived in for most of her life. It would be so easy to surrender to it now, to pack her single bag and disappear, to run as she had always wanted to run. But then she saw Silas's face in her mind, his eyes full of a weary hope when he spoke of marriage. She felt the ghost of his lips on the back of her hand, the solid warmth of his coat wrapped around her in the blizzard. He had offered her a home, a name, a future. He had stood up for her. She could not abandon him now. The despair receded, replaced by a cold, hard anger that burned away her fear. Royce Talbot thought he had won. He thought she was just a timid little housekeeper he could sweep aside. He did not know her. He did not know the strength that grows in the forgotten corners of the world, in the hearts of those who have nothing left to lose. She saddled the mare, her movements swift and decisive. She did not ride to the jail. There was nothing she could do for Silas there. Instead, she rode to the Firth ranch. She found Jedediah and his sons mending a harness in the barn, their faces grim. They had already heard the news. "He is a good man, Silas Boone," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble of anger. "This is not justice." "It is a theft," Mara said, her voice clear and strong, devoid of the shyness that had once defined her. "And Silas is not his only victim." She looked Jedediah straight in the eye. "Talbot is robbing you, too. Your loan, 2 years ago. You had an extension. The signature on that document is a forgery. I have seen it. He charged you a 20% fee for that extension, but in his private ledger, he recorded it as a 30% fee and has been compounding the interest on that higher amount ever since." Jedediah stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. How could you possibly know that?" "Because I have seen his books," she said simply. She rode from the Firths to the Schmidts, and then to 2 other small ranches that bordered Talbot's ever-expanding territory. To each family, she told a similar story, revealing a specific, secret detail of their own debt, a discrepancy they had perhaps suspected but could never prove. She did not have the notebook, but she had memorized the details. Her memory became the evidence, her conviction the force that gave it weight. She was no longer just Silas Boone's housekeeper. She was the bearer of an inconvenient and dangerous truth, a seed of rebellion, planted in the fertile ground of desperation, began to sprout. Her next stop was the small building that housed the Dry Willow Press. Mason Firth, Jedediah's cousin, was a quiet, thoughtful man with ink stains on his fingers and a belief in the power of the printed word. She laid out her plan, her voice low and urgent. "He will destroy you," Mason said, his concern warring with a spark of outrage in his eyes. "He is destroying us all already," Mara countered. "All I'm asking is that you help me show people the truth. They deserve to know who they are in business with." By nightfall, a plan was in motion. Mara, hidden in the back room of the printing press, painstakingly wrote out the text for a flyer. She listed names, dates, and interest rates. She described the different colored inks Talbot used to distinguish his real records from the falsified copies he gave his clients. It was a declaration of war, written on a sheet of foolscap. The next morning, the town of Dry Willow awoke to a new reality. Anonymous leaflets had appeared on every door, on the hitching posts, on the community notice board. They were stark, simple, and devastating. They laid bare the mechanics of Roy C. Talbot's greed, transforming vague suspicions into concrete accusations. The town began to buzz, the whispers of gossip replaced by the angry murmur of a community betrayed. Mara's final ally was the town's moral compass, Reverend Lyle. She found him in the small wooden church, polishing the pulpit. He had read the flyer. She saw it in his troubled eyes. "I have sat in my study, Reverend," Mara said, "and listened to good men, honest men, confess their despair to God. They blame the drought. They blame themselves, but they should be blaming the man who holds their deeds. You have seen their pain. You know I am telling the truth." The Reverend looked at his hands, then at the simple cross hanging on the wall. "The Lord's house should be a place of truth," he said softly. "It seems it is time we let some of that truth out into the town square." The confrontation took place at the town hall that afternoon. It was not a formal hearing, but it had the weight of one. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. The ranchers Mara had visited stood in a silent, grim-faced cluster. On one side of the room stood Roy C. Talbot, his face a mask of cold fury, with Brand Coyle and 2 other hired thugs standing behind him. Deputy Keats stood near the front, looking pale and nervous, a man caught in a current too strong for him to swim against. In the back, Silas stood between 2 deputies, his hands cuffed in front of him. His face was bruised, but when his eyes found Mara, a look of fierce, desperate pride shone through. Reverend Lyle spoke first, his voice echoing in the silent room. He spoke of the sanctity of a man's word, of the sin of usury, of the despair he had witnessed in his flock. He did not name Talbot, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Then, Mara stepped forward. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the quiet girl from the stagecoach, the shy housekeeper, but the woman who stood before them now was transformed. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a righteous anger. She faced Talbot directly. "You accuse Mr. Boone of stealing," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised everyone, most of all herself. "But you, Mr. Talbot, are the real thief. You steal with false signatures and invisible ink." Talbot laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "This is absurd, the ravings of a hysterical girl. You have no proof. Your so-called evidence is in the custody of the law." At that moment, Mason Firth stepped forward, holding a flat, rectangular object. "This is the printing plate for this morning's flyers," he announced, his voice steady. "Every word on it was given to me by Miss Quinn, and I will swear on a Bible that she read those facts from your own ledgers." Talbot's composure finally cracked. His eyes darted around the room. Seeing the hard, accusatory faces, he was losing control. In a single, desperate motion, he drew a pistol from his coat. He lunged for the closest person, grabbing Deputy Keats and pulling him back. The muzzle of the gun pressed against the deputy's temple. "Nobody moves," Talbot screamed, his voice high and ragged. The room erupted in chaos. People scrambled back. Brand Coyle and his men drew their own weapons, their eyes scanning the crowd. Keats, held fast in Talbot's grip, looked out at the faces of his neighbors. He saw their fear and their anger. He saw Mara, standing her ground, her expression one of fierce determination. And in that moment, something inside the timid deputy finally broke. He had spent years bowing to this man, swallowing his own conscience. He would not die as his coward. With a sudden, violent twist, Keats brought his own pistol up, jamming it hard into Talbot's ribs. "Let me go, Royce," Keats gritted out, his voice shaking but resolute. "It is over." Talbot, stunned by the betrayal, hesitated for a split second. It was all the opening the room needed. Jedediah Firth and two other ranchers surged forward. A wild, desperate brawl exploded. Fists flew, furniture splintered. In the confusion, Jedediah grabbed the keys from a deputy's belt and unlocked Silas's cuffs. Silas was free, but his eyes were only on Mara. He saw Brand Coyle, his face a mask of rage, raise his pistol and take aim at her. "No," Silas roared. Launching himself across the room, he threw himself in front of Mara, shielding her body with his own, ready to take the bullet meant for her. But in that same instant, Mara acted. A gun had fallen to the floor during the scuffle. She had scooped it up, the heavy iron unfamiliar but solid in her hand. She raised it, her arm trembling violently, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Brand Coyle cried out and staggered back, not from a wound, but from sheer shock. The bullet had torn his hat from his head, leaving a neat hole in the felt crown. He stared at Mara, his eyes wide with disbelief. The timid girl, the bastard child, had just tried to kill him. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The townspeople, their courage ignited, surrounded Talbot and his men, overwhelming them. Disarmed and battered, the banker was held fast. The aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Talbot, his face bleeding and his fine suit torn, was locked in the very cell that had held Silas. His thugs were secured alongside him. Deputy Keats, his hands still shaking, unpinned the silver star from his chest and laid it on the desk. "I am not fit to wear this," he said, his voice thick with shame. He looked at the townspeople. "I am sorry, I was a coward." Justice had come to Dry Willow. It had not come from the law, but from the community itself. It had been sparked by the quiet courage of a woman who had finally refused to be a victim, who had stood up to protect her home, her future, and the man she loved. The world after the storm of violence was unnaturally quiet. Dry Willow seemed to hold its breath for a day, the townsfolk moving about with a dazed, uncertain air, but the silence was one of relief. Not fear. The tyrant was in a cage, and the air, for the first time in years, tasted clean. A circuit judge arrived from Cheyenne 2 days later, a stern, hawk-nosed man who took one look at Talbot's meticulously fraudulent ledgers and declared all outstanding debts connected to them null and void. The news spread like a prairie fire, a wave of collective, disbelieving joy. Mortgages that had been like nooses around the necks of good families for a decade were suddenly gone. The land was theirs again. Silas Boone's deed was returned to him, the paper feeling impossibly light in his hands. He was a free man. The healing of the town began in earnest, and it started with apologies, one by one. Men who had stood by silently while Talbot's thugs rode roughshod over their neighbors came to the Boone ranch. They came with hats in their hands and shame in their eyes, offering a day's labor to help rebuild his fences, a sack of seed for his fields, a spare plow blade. They were small gestures, but they were the threads that began to reweave the frayed fabric of the community. The most surprising visitor was Hester Pike. She arrived one afternoon in her best Sunday dress, carrying a freshly baked apple pie that smelled of cinnamon and contrition. She found Mara in her small garden, tending to the green shoots that were now pushing their way through the soil with a stubborn will to live. "Miss Quinn," Hester began, her usual sharp tone softened by an unfamiliar humility. I have come to say I was wrong." Mara stopped her work and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "I have a tongue that wags quicker than my sense," Hester continued, her eyes fixed on the pie she was holding as if it were a shield. "I saw what I wanted to see, and I said things that were unkind and untrue. What you did, for this town, for all of us, well, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen. This is for you and Mr. Boone, and I would consider it an honor if you would both attend a town picnic this Saturday, in the meadow behind the church, to celebrate, well, to celebrate the truth, winning out over lies." It was an invitation, but it was also a peace offering. It was the town admitting its fault and asking for forgiveness. Mara looked at the woman, at the genuine remorse in her eyes, and she gave a small, accepting nod. "Of course, Mrs. Pike, we would be pleased to come." The Saturday of the picnic dawned bright and clear. The harsh, dry wind of the past seasons had given way to a gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of new grass and damp earth. Spring had arrived in Wyoming, a tentative but determined season of rebirth. The meadow behind the church was filled with people, their faces relaxed and smiling. Children, released from the oppressive tension that had gripped their parents, ran shrieking with laughter, their bright clothes like wildflowers scattered across the green. The sound of a banjo, lively and cheerful, drifted on the air, accompanied by the murmur of easy conversation. Silas and Mara walked into the gathering, and a strange thing happened. The talking did not stop. The whispers did not start. Instead, people turned to them with open, friendly smiles. Jedediah Firth clapped Silas on the shoulder, his grip firm and warm. "Mrs." Schmidt pressed a jar of her spiced peaches into Mara's hands, patting her arm with a work-worn hand. They were not outcasts. They were not objects of gossip or pity. They were heroes. They were part of the community, its new, resilient heart. They ate plates piled high with fried chicken and cornbread, sitting on a blanket under a large cottonwood tree. Silas watched Mara as she spoke with Mrs. Firth, a small, genuine smile on her face. He had never seen her look so at ease, so unguarded. The haunted, watchful expression that had always lingered in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident light. He felt a swell of love for her so powerful it almost hurt, a feeling that was wholly new, entirely his own, and not in the shadow of any memory. Later in the afternoon, as the party continued its happy, rambling course, Silas touched her arm. "Come with me," he said softly. He led her away from the crowd, following the sound of running water. They walked to the small creek that bordered the meadow. For years it had been a dry, cracked bed. But now, fed by the melting snows from the bighorns, it was running again. The water was clear and cold, gurgling over smooth stones. The sound a liquid promise of life renewed. The banks were dotted with the first pale green shoots of new birch leaves. They stood in silence for a long time, just listening to the water. The sound seemed to wash away the last vestiges of the drought, of the hardship and the fear. "It is really over," Mara said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded. "It is. A new beginning." He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled something out. He had spent the previous evening in his workshop, not with iron, but with wood. In the palm of his hand lay a simple ring, carved from a piece of pale, smooth birch wood. He had sanded it for hours, until it felt like silk against the skin. He took her left hand, the one he had first held on the day they dug the ditch. It was no longer calloused and blistered, but soft and strong. "Mara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have been living in the past for a long time. It was a cold, lonely place. You brought me out of it. You showed me that a man's heart can have more than one chapter." He looked into her gray eyes, wanting her to see the absolute truth of his words. "I am not asking you to forget your past, the hurts you have carried. I would never ask that. I am just asking you to save a place for me in your future." He slipped the simple wooden ring onto her third finger. It was a perfect fit. It was not gold or silver. It held no precious stone, but it was more valuable than anything Royce Talbot had ever owned. It was a circle of promise, carved from the wood of a tree that knew how to survive the harshest winters and be reborn in the spring. Tears welled in Mara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound, so complete. She had never imagined it was possible to feel it. She looked from the ring on her finger to the earnest, loving face of the man who had put it there. He smiled, a gentle, tender smile. He lifted her hand, the one now bearing his ring, and just as he had done on that dusty evening weeks ago, he pressed a soft kiss to the back of it. This time, she did not look away. This time, her smile was not a shy deflection, but a radiant, open expression of her heart. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling through her tears. "Keep it," she whispered, her voice full of laughter and love. He did not let go of her hand. He held it tight, his thumb stroking the smooth wood of the ring. He looked back at her, his own eyes shining. "I already did," he said, his voice low and full of a love that had been growing since the beginning. "I have been keeping it since that day at the dusty stagecoach stop." The year turned. The snows of the sudden, violent winter melted into the thirsty earth, and a spring of impossible greenness followed. The Boone Ranch, which had for so long been a study in browns and grays, came back to life with a fierce, vibrant tenacity. The irrigation ditch, once a desperate scar of raw dirt, was now a permanent artery. Its banks softened by a fringe of lush grass. Water, clear and cold, flowed steadily, a constant, soothing murmur that spoke of endurance and a future. The cattle, their ribs no longer stark beneath their hides, grew fat in the revived pasture. The small herd had not just survived, it had thrived. New calves, spindly-legged and curious, followed their mothers, a testament to the return of abundance. The ranch was breathing again. The peace they had fought for was not an easy, idle thing. It was a peace built of daily work and shared purpose. Silas was up before the dawn, his days once again filled with the familiar, satisfying rhythms of mending fences, tending stock, and turning soil. But the crushing weight of impending doom was gone. He moved with a lighter step, a quiet hum sometimes escaping his lips. He was no longer just a survivor clinging to a legacy of grief. He was a builder, a man laying the foundation for a new life. One bright morning in late spring, he brought home a wagon loaded with a dozen young birch saplings. He worked all day along the creek bed where he had proposed, digging a line of perfect holes in the rich, dark earth. He planted each tree with a careful reverence, his big hands gentle on the delicate roots. This was not a fence to keep things out, but a line to mark a beginning. Each tree was a promise, a living monument to the day he had asked Mara to share his future. He envisioned them growing tall and strong, their white bark a silver line against the blue sky, their leaves whispering in the summer wind for years to come, a testament for anyone to see that love could take root and flourish even in the harshest of lands. Mara, too, had found a new purpose, one that extended beyond the fences of the ranch. Her quiet literacy, once a private comfort, became a gift to the community. Twice a week, the porch of the Boone house was transformed into a makeshift schoolhouse. The children from the surrounding ranches, the Firth and Schmidt children among them, would gather on the steps, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with wonder. Mara would sit in a rocking chair, a book open in her lap, and read to them. She had a gift for it, her voice calm and clear, drawing the children into worlds of adventure and magic they had never imagined. She taught the older ones their letters, guiding their small, clumsy hands as they formed the strange, powerful shapes on a slate. To see a child's face light up as they recognized their own name for the first time was a joy so pure it felt like a kind of prayer. The town that had once whispered about the strange, solitary girl now entrusted her with their most precious resource, their children's minds. She was no longer Mara Quinn, the orphan, the outsider. She was Mrs. Boone, a teacher, a respected and beloved part of their world. The past was not forgotten. It had been integrated, like a healed bone, stronger in the broken place. Royce Talbot and his men were gone, sentenced to a long term in the federal prison in Laramie. The town, free of his shadow, began to prosper in a way it never had before, on a foundation of mutual trust and shared labor. The fear was gone, and in its place, something far more resilient had grown. Their wedding had been as simple and as true as the wooden ring on Mara's finger. They had stood by the creek, beside the newly planted birch saplings, with only the Firths and the Schmidts as witnesses. Reverend Lyle had spoken not of scripture, but of the seasons, of drought and rain, of the quiet strength it takes to endure and the courage it takes to love. Silas had looked at Mara, her face framed by the soft spring sunlight, and felt a sense of rightness so profound it settled deep in his bones. This was his home. She was his home. The evenings were the best time. The day's work would be done, the air cooling as the sun began its slow descent. They would sit together on the porch steps, the same steps where Mara now taught, and watch the sky catch fire. The harsh, scouring wind of the high plains had gentled. It now moved through the tall grass with a soft, rustling sound, like a contented sigh. On one such evening, the sunset poured a molten gold across the landscape, burnishing the green hills and painting the undersides of the clouds in strokes of rose and violet. They sat in comfortable silence, a habit they had perfected, their presence enough for one another. Silas's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, easy fit. His gaze drifted to the wall inside the house. Visible through the open door, two objects hung there, side by side on a small, polished piece of wood he had mounted. On the left was the silver locket, tarnished and old, its engraved letters M.Q. and T a testament to a difficult and lonely past. On the right was the simple, pale birchwood ring he had worn for the ceremony, her past and their present, hanging together. They were not hidden away in a drawer or buried under new memories. They were honored, accepted, two parts of a single, complete story. The story of the woman he loved, and the story of the life they were now building. The locket was a history of survival. The ring was a promise of peace. Mara followed his gaze, and a soft, understanding smile touched her lips. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her dark honey hair warm against his cheek. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything they had overcome, and everything they had to look forward to. It was the silence of a deep and abiding peace, a peace that had been hard won, and was all the more precious for it. Their hearts were no longer lonely, and when Silas held Mara's hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers, he still kept it, just as he always had. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.